The cold breeze cut through the heavy silence of the corridors of Asylum Blackwood, where mold and damp permeated the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere. On the rusted walls, stains from a forgotten past seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves were breathing in the suffering that had accumulated there. It was in this decaying setting that the file of Abel Montague was found, abandoned among torn papers and forgotten objects. Record No. 2541. Patient Abel Montague. Admission November 12, 1923. Transferred after erratic behavior and delusions of grandeur. Age 38 years. Initial diagnosis: persecutory psychosis with megalomania. History: Abel Montague was an inventor and mechanic who began to manifest ideas that time as a living entity was deteriorating. His obsession with correcting the failure of time was deemed the primary factor for his admission. Additional notes: a small broken pocket watch was found in his possession during admission. Abel believed this object contained the key to saving the world from imminent collapse. The reading of the record is interrupted by a distant noise, the sound of muffled footsteps, or perhaps the echo of something that should have been left behind. The name Abel Montague echoes like a whisper, and soon the narrator's voice becomes a murmur that reverberates in the room, absorbing every word. Abel arrived at the asylum with an almost palpable presence, as if something beyond his flesh and bone was there, observing. He crossed the gates like a shadow, with a broken pocket watch clutched in his calloused hands. The object, broken, was all he had, and he defended it with a ferocity that transcended that of an ordinary man. The watch represented something more than time. It represented the only line still connecting him to his mission, to his perception of an inevitable destiny. When the guards attempted to take it from his hands, Abel reacted like a cornered animal, his posture rigid and the expression on his face unperturbed. In the early days, Abel did not interact with anyone else, neither the doctors nor the other inmates. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, at a point beyond what anyone could reach. He regarded them with disdain, as if they were pieces of a disassembled puzzle. When he finally broke the silence, it was to utter enigmatic words, like an echo from a mind in ruins. "You wouldn't understand," he said, with a smile that resembled a cut more than a gesture of humor. The first reports from Dr. Haversham indicated that Abel was possessed by an unshakable conviction. He believed that there was a cosmic flaw in the very fabric of time, a flaw that only he could rectify. "Time is not what you think. It is sick," he would say, staring intently at the small clock in his hands. "You live in the residue of time." For Abel, time was not an abstraction. He saw it as a living entity, something that needed to be restored to its original order. The space in the asylum was quickly recognized by Abel as an affront to his mission. He viewed the place as a prison for broken minds, incapable of understanding his greatness. He did not trust the doctors and saw them as obstacles, distractions from a vital task. "While I am trapped here, the gears of the world continue to rust," he wrote in his diary, pressing the pen with such force that the words nearly tore through the paper. As the days went by, Abel's obsession grew. He demanded tools, anything that could help him reconstruct the mechanism he believed to be lost. When denied, he would murmur incomprehensible words, like calculations from a disturbed mathematician, and soon surrendered himself to compulsive work. His hands, guided by an unknown need, began to fashion small devices, metal structures that he believed were necessary to adjust time. But the true focus of his obsession was the broken clock, the object he never set aside. Abel claimed that within the clock lay the key to saving humanity. He would turn it obsessively, as if trying to restore something he could not even name. When questioned about its significance, he would merely laugh. "Do you not see? It's all right there before you," he would say, as if explaining something obvious, something only the enlightened could understand. Paranoid psychosis was the initial diagnosis, but something more disturbing lurked beneath that label. The doctors were beginning to realize that Abel's mind operated in a cold and relentless manner, like a machine that, although broken, still tried to adjust itself. But it was a doomed clock, its gears rusted and worn, unable to align. A week later, something strange happened. The clock in the observation room, which had been running perfectly until then, began to lose time. It was not a significant delay, but it was enough to catch Abel's attention. He did not laugh with joy. He laughed with a disquieting calm, as if he had anticipated something that others had yet to see. "Do you think this is a coincidence? The gears are screaming," he said, his words laden with a sense of foreboding. Abel was now obsessed. He watched the clocks of the asylum like a hunter, waiting for them to confess what he believed to be the flaw he was desperately trying to fix. His mission, more than a necessity, seemed to be a condemnation. With each new clock that stopped or lagged, he saw confirmation that the collapse was imminent. Abel's hands continued to turn the invisible hands of what he called the temporal matrix, believing that there was still time. Time to correct, time to restore, time to save. But while the pocket watch remained broken, he too remained broken. And perhaps, on some level, he knew it. Abel Montague had become a disturbing presence within the asylum Blackwood. His disdain for the environment and the doctors was palpable, more visible than the dust floating in the stuffy corridors. He moved with the urgency of someone who knew that time was his only enemy, yet refused to waste it on explanations for those who, in his mind, were nothing more than faulty pieces of a broken machine. The doctors and nurses, just like the inmates, were unworthy of his attention. To him, they were all trapped in a cycle of ignorance, while he saw beyond space and time, focusing on the bits of metal and wires that took over his cell. As the days passed, the disdain for his surroundings was replaced by frantic action. Abel began to improvise devices with what he had on hand. Rusty pieces of metal, loose wires, even wood ripped from his bed. Each piece was carefully examined and adjusted, as if he were a craftsman dedicated to a greater work. "I am building the main gear," he would say in a distant tone, as if the task was beyond anyone's comprehension. The metallic sound of his creations reverberated through the walls of the cell, a disturbing echo that, for him, meant progress. But for others, it was a reminder of how far removed he was from reality. Abel rarely slept. His cell seemed illuminated by its own energy, and his hands, cut and stained with rust, appeared to feel no wear. The makeshift tools he used were inadequate, but that did not bother him. The doctors, observing his obsession, recorded in their reports that he surpassed all limits of rationality in his quest. Abel spoke to himself as he worked, and his words, now fragmented and incomprehensible, were repeated in his journals. "The alignment is still off," he wrote. "The seconds are slipping away." The confidence Abel had shown at the beginning began to crumble, giving way to restlessness and growing frustration. Abel's obsession took on even deeper proportions as time passed. His cell became a reflection of his disturbed mind. Every surface was covered in drawings and calculations, symbols that repeated in increasingly complex patterns. He believed the cycle was aligning, yet he never saw himself close to perfection. To him, perfection was the only thing that could prevent collapse, but what that collapse meant, no one knew. His words seemed increasingly disjointed, as if he were battling against invisible forces. He described hesitations in the flow, resistances, incomplete cycles, all elements of an impossible machine, existing only in his mind. As his obsession grew, Abel demanded more materials. Broken clocks, extra gears, pieces of glass. When his requests were refused, he began to look at the doctors as if they were the faulty parts of the machine he needed to fix. Eventually, the staff yielded, more out of curiosity than compassion, wishing to observe how far his mind would take them and how far he could push the mechanisms he was creating. His devices, though rudimentary, were strangely functional. They whirred, clicked, and produced metallic sounds that echoed through the corridors near his cell. Some staff reported unsettling experiences as they passed by, feeling as if time, for a brief moment, had slowed down or sped up. These accounts were dismissed as coincidences or the result of psychological suggestion, but the rumors began to spread. Abel, of course, was unaware of this. He continued working, claiming that the cycle was almost complete. As his records accumulated, they became more chaotic. Strange symbolisms began to surface, almost as if he were creating a new language to describe what he saw and felt. Time is not linear. It bends. It always bends. The doctors could not decipher these statements, but there was something in them that deeply unsettled them. There was an unusual weight to them, a hidden truth that they could not comprehend. Now consumed by his obsession, Abel no longer looked at the people around him. His initial arrogance had vanished, replaced by overwhelming determination. He was no longer the man who believed himself the only one capable of correcting the flow of time. He had become a broken piece within the very mechanism he was trying to restore. The frustration with his failure became evident, yet his determination never wavered. At the end of this stage, the doctors found a final note in his journal, which made it clear that Abel no longer controlled his own mind. "If I stop, the cycle stops with me. Cannot stop. Never." These words were a silent scream from someone who, even in his madness, knew that his task would never end. A task without answer, without solution. And perhaps deep down he knew that. Your obsession ceases to be merely a reflection of your troubled mind, transforming into a force capable of distorting the reality around you. Small details, such as the imperceptible delay of a clock in the observation room, begin to carry an abnormal weight. The mechanism that has always functioned with precision starts to misalign, but only Abel notices. For him, these failures are revelations, not mere coincidences. He points them out with conviction, and even the doctors hesitate to dismiss them as simple paranoia. "The gears are resisting," he writes in his diary, with handwriting now almost uncontrollable, the pen pressing so hard against the paper that it nearly tears the page. He does not see these delays as failures but as signs. Signs that his mission is underway, but also that invisible forces are trying to sabotage him. Someone is pulling the hands in the wrong direction. It is not human, he notes with an increasingly desperate tone. As the days go by, Abel's paranoia intensifies. He avoids any interaction with the doctors, refusing even to participate in regular assessments. When forced to attend, he remains silent, his eyes fixed, observing the doctors as if trying to unravel them, searching for something beyond the physical, something hidden. He begins to believe that even the gears can disguise themselves as men. His behavior affects the very rhythm of the asylum. Staff members start to report inexplicable experiences when passing near his cell. Some speak of a heaviness in the air, as if time were being compressed. Others say they felt a slowdown, as if time were moving more slowly for a moment. These experiences, although not officially documented, begin to generate a silent doubt among the staff. But Abel remains oblivious to these changes, immersed in his obsession. He dedicates every moment of his day to working with the mechanisms, adjusting invisible gears with fingers that move repetitively, as if guided by something beyond his own will. His cell transforms into a sanctuary of obsession, filled with pieces of metal, confused drawings, and incomplete devices, all seemingly connected by a purpose that only he understands. Abel completely withdraws from any social interaction. He does not respond to questions, nor does he acknowledge the nurses who enter his cell. He seems so deeply absorbed in what he does that the world around him disappears. Rest time, when it occurs, is minimal. His fingers continue to move, adjusting invisible gears while he sleeps. In his journal, found years later, Abel describes a growing sense of despair and obsession. "I hear a sound that no one else can hear," he writes, referring to the sound of immense gears that, in his mind, are trying to turn but encountering resistance. "The sound is getting louder. The gears are screaming. They are testing me. I need to keep going." His inventions become more complex, more chaotic. In a moment of apparent clarity, he writes, "I thought I was the watchmaker, but perhaps I am just a gear. Perhaps I am also being adjusted." His madness is also reflected in his interaction with the devices. He begins to treat them as if they were living entities, murmuring to himself as he works, reprimanding the parts that do not function or turn as they should. Apparently, he hears responses, leaning in and listening to something that others cannot perceive. The growing unease among the staff transforms into fear. Some begin to question whether his words and actions are the product of advanced psychological collapse, or if, in some way, he is perceiving something real, something beyond their understanding. The most disturbing moment of this period occurs one night when the guards find him standing in front of a clock on the wall of his cell. Abel remains motionless for hours, his eyes fixed on the hands that, to him, are disobeying. When approached, he finally turns to the guards and, in a low and reverent tone, says, "Don't you see? It's all out of sync. But I will fix it." Doubt begins to permeate everyone in the Blackwood Asylum. Is Abel merely dragging everyone into his delirium? Or is he truly perceiving something that others cannot comprehend? As his obsession consumes him, the asylum seems to bend around him, as if he were the core of something larger and undefined, something that no one has yet been able to decipher. The line between reality and madness narrows even further for Abel, as he sinks into a spiral of restlessness and obsession, in an unending quest for a repair that seems never-ending. The deep silence of the asylum was broken by the metallic sound of something spinning. Discreet yet constant, the sound resembled the heart of a machine that had just awakened. Abel Montague, immersed in his cell transformed into an improvised workshop, was before his device. The mechanism, a tangle of rusty gears, wires, and worn pieces of metal, spun slowly, emitting irregular clicks. To any observer, it might have seemed a fragile and worthless creation, but to Abel, it represented something monumental. He leaned over it, his face illuminated by an unsettling triumph. "The first turn is complete," he murmured, marking the beginning of a new phase in his obsession. The doctors, who had authorized the construction of the device to study his behavior, were disappointed with the results. To them, the object appeared inert, incapable of any real effect. But Abel saw in the irregular movement of the gears something that no one else could comprehend. In his notes, he wrote, "The cycle has begun, but still hesitates. The gears are recognizing the alignment. I need to adjust more." After the activation of the device, Abel's obsession intensified. He began to demand clocks of all kinds, asking for them to be brought to his cell. Wall clocks, pocket watches, even broken pieces that no one else considered useful. He claimed he needed these materials to understand the nuances of the gears. Initially, the doctors refused, fearing that this would only feed his obsession. However, upon noticing that Abel was developing specific patterns in his behavior, they relented. They began to provide old and damaged clocks, hoping to understand how far his mind could take him. The clocks became the center of Abel's life. He dismantled them with precision, studying each piece as if they were sacred relics, and then attempted to reassemble them. He spent hours adjusting hands, aligning gears, his repetitive and methodical movements acquiring an almost ritualistic tone. Abel entered a state of profound trance, his hands moving as if guided by a force beyond his own will. He did not eat, did not sleep regularly. His sole function was work, with his breathing synchronizing to the sound of the spinning gears. The doctors began to notice subtle yet disturbing changes. Some of the clocks that Abel repaired, even in irreparable conditions, seemed to function for brief periods, marking time accurately before stopping again. "They are not ready," Abel murmured whenever this happened. For him, these temporary failures were signs of progress, not defeats. "The gears are aligning," he wrote in his diary. "The rhythm is almost correct, but there is resistance. Something still fights against the balance." The staff who delivered the clocks began to report unsettling experiences upon entering Abel's cell. Some described a feeling of heaviness in the air, as if time were being compressed. Others mentioned hearing an irregular ticking, almost like an echo, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. These experiences were not officially documented, but rumors began to spread throughout the asylum. Abel, however, seemed oblivious to any reaction around him. He was completely absorbed in his work, his eyes fixated on the pieces he was building or adjusting. In one of his notes, he wrote, "They feel the movement, but do not understand it. Alignment requires sacrifice. The gears do not move on their own." This enigmatic phrase was interpreted by the doctors as an admission that Abel was consuming himself with his obsession. For him, however, it was merely a practical observation. Time was a machine that required a dedicated operator. As the weeks passed, Abel's cell became an almost sacred space. Clocks covered the surfaces, each one adjusted with precision or dismantled in search of something that only he seemed to understand. He arranged the clocks in patterns, lining them up in rows or circles, as if they followed their own logic. When asked about the reason, he would shake his head, as if the question were absurd. "Can't you see?" he would murmur from time to time. "The rhythm is here. It's in all of us." A particular event caught the medical team's attention. A wall clock, given to Abel for being completely stopped, began to function spontaneously after he worked on it for days on end. Not only did it work, but it also kept time with a precision that none of the doctors could explain, especially considering its original state. Abel did not seem surprised. He merely looked at the clock with a silently approving expression before writing in his diary, "The first adjustment is complete. Now the next cycle can begin." However, not all the clocks followed the same pattern. Some, after being adjusted, broke again almost violently, with gears jumping or hands jamming at impossible angles. Abel did not appear disturbed by these incidents. He saw them as a message. "They are resisting," he wrote in another entry. "The forces are testing the balance. But I will persist." As the experiment intensified, Abel seemed to drift even further from reality. He no longer spoke to the doctors, not even to express disdain. His life was completely dedicated to the mechanisms and the sound of the gears. He had become, for all intents and purposes, an extension of the machines he so venerated. And as the doctors continued to observe, a question hung in the air. Who, after all, was controlling whom? Abel Montague's transformation in the asylum Blackwood became an inevitable and disturbing reality. The arrogance that had defined him at the beginning faded away, giving way to an unrelenting focus that mechanized not just his hands but his entire existence. He no longer looked at the doctors or the guards with disdain. Instead, he lowered his head, adjusting invisible gears in the air, as if there was nothing else around him. The man who had once walked through the gates of the asylum with an aura of superiority no longer existed. Only a living machine remained, functioning in synchrony with the devices he so revered. His cell transformed into a peculiar laboratory, covered with meticulously hand-drawn diagrams and formulas that eluded the understanding of the doctors. The bed, once meant for rest, had become an improvised workbench, where broken clocks, gears, and tools were obsessively organized. The muffled sound of ticking, emanating from the devices he adjusted, filled the space and created an unsettling feeling that the very air was marked by the rhythm of the machines. Abel became known among the inmates and medical staff as the clockmaker of the asylum. His work with clocks had become his sole reason for existence. He dismantled and reassembled them with almost surgical precision, studying each piece as if it were part of a grand universal mechanism, something only he understood. The concept of time and its gears had become his obsession. His journals, once filled with confusion and delirium, now took on a more philosophical and resigned tone. "The hands turn, but I am merely the force that moves them. Without me, they have no purpose. But without them, perhaps I have none either," he wrote, as if he had become an inseparable part of the mechanisms he adjusted. Abel became increasingly absorbed in his work. His movements were not chaotic. They were like those of a well-calibrated machine. He dismantled clocks and adjusted gears for hours without ever showing fatigue. Sleeping and eating became almost non-existent activities. His work was incessant, and when a clock broke, he simply started over, taking it apart piece by piece, as if he were revisiting the work of an invisible force. "The clocks work for a short period and then stop again," he wrote in his journal. "The balance is temporary. The gears always return to misalignment. Perhaps that is what defines time. an eternal cycle of adjustments and failures. Over time, the sound of clocks filled his cell and reverberated through the corridors of the asylum, creating its own energy. Guards and staff began to avoid the sector where he was confined, claiming to feel an inexplicable discomfort. Some reported a sensation of déjà vu, as if minutes were being repeated. Others spoke of an acceleration or deceleration of time, a distortion that no one could comprehend. But Abel remained oblivious to these reactions, completely immersed in his task. When an old pendulum clock, damaged beyond repair, was brought to him, the medical team saw it as a final challenge, perhaps even a provocation. Abel, unresponsive, spent weeks working on it. Days turned into weeks, until finally, the soft sound of the pendulum echoed through the cell. The clock was working, but, as always, marking 12:15. When a doctor observed the event, Abel finally spoke, for the first time in months. Now it is part of it too. He picked up his diary for the last time and wrote, in almost illegible handwriting, "I have adjusted everything I could. Now, time walks alone." The next morning, he was motionless, sitting on his bed, his eyes fixed on a distant point. His cell pulsed with the constant and rhythmic sound of perfectly synchronized clocks. Decades later, his cell was found intact. The clocks, all showing 12:15, still functioned with a precision that no one could replicate or explain. Visitors to the asylum reported feeling the discomfort that former staff had mentioned, a sense that time did not follow its normal flow in that space. Some swore they could hear the sound of gears, as if Abel were still there, working in silence. His final diary was found, tucked away among his diagrams and devices. The last sentence, underlined emphatically, remained etched in the minds of all who read it. "Time does not need me, but I will always be a part of it." Abel Montague then became more than just a man. He transformed into a legend, a presence that never left the asylum, as if each tick and each talk were his way of continuing to adjust the world around him. If you feel that the rhythm of time distorted for a moment while listening to the story of Abel Montague, be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Who knows, the next adjustment might be yours. Until next time, where time will never be the same.